Freud and the American Child, one in a series of programs dealing with some of the discoveries and errors of Sigmund Freud, a series titled Man is Not a Thing. First, you will hear Dr. Erich Fromm, psychoanalyst and author, as recorded in his study in Cuernavaca, Mexico. Then you will meet Robert Nisbet, Dean of the College of Letters and Science, University of California, Riverside, together with Floyd Ross, Professor of World Religions of the Southern California School of Theology, and Dr. Edward Rudin, Chief Psychiatrist of the California State Mental Hygiene Clinic in Riverside. Now, here is Erich Fromm, as interviewed by John Harder in Cuernavaca, Mexico.
Dr. Fromm, what specifically new things did Freud discover about childhood?
This is, of course, not quite easy to answer because he discovered quite a few things. But I would say that perhaps his two main discoveries are the one concerning infantile sexuality, and the other one is that the character of a person is essentially formed in the early years of childhood.
How early, and how early did he feel this took place?
Well, really, from the first day of birth on. But maybe I could say first a word about his discovery of infantile sexuality. Today, this does not sound so surprising anymore. We are accustomed to a good deal of evolutionary thinking today under the influence of Darwin and many scientists after him. And so it is not so difficult for us anymore to expect that sexuality is not a force which suddenly erupts and emerges at the age of puberty, but that it is something which develops slowly and which has its beginning with the very beginning of life. In the Victorian age, the general idea was that the little child was like a little angel, utterly pure and uncontaminated, so to speak, by the passions of the adult man, and that then with puberty, suddenly new passionate forces break out and emerge, namely that of sexuality. Now, Freud showed that sexuality does not appear suddenly, that it begins already in childhood, that it goes through various stages of development, and that already in childhood the sexual urges exist, and that there is nothing to be ashamed about, nothing to criticize about, and that these things are to be taken as part of human nature and of the child's nature as anything else, as everything else. I would say the discovery of infantile sexuality was a much more revolutionary and challenging one in the year 1900 than it is today, though even today people talk about it a great deal, and when it comes to really facing the fact that a little child has already sexual strivings, quite a few are shocked when in words they might talk about it quite glibly. That is the first discovery of Freud, which, as I said, perhaps has more of historical value than it is so important today.
I should like to return to that, but a little later. But you say the second discovery, the formation of character during childhood. I am interested in the word character here.
Well, in fact, I'm very glad that you say that, because the concept character is really the most central concept for understanding man. Each man has a character. And by that I mean in each person, his forces, his psychic forces, are organized and structured in a certain way, which make him look at the world from a certain standpoint, which make him feel and act in a certain way according to his character. Now, the great discovery which Freud made was that the formation of this character, aside, of course, from certain constitutional factors, which one must not underestimate, begins already in early childhood. You might say that the character of a child develops in response to the stimuli which it experiences from the significant people in his childhood. And that at the age of 5 or 6, the basic structure of the character has already developed, and that's why it is so difficult to change oneself later.
Well, to look at these two tremendous ideas from the perspective of today, infant sexuality and the character formation in childhood, should these two ideas still stand?
Yes, I would say these two ideas still stand. All the evidence in the study of children, in the study of the development of personality, in psychopathology, confirm the basic correctness of these two ideas.
Well, in what respect do they not stand?
Well, this is, of course, a matter of opinion, and those who have remained strict adherents of Freud would give a different answer to your question than I'm giving. I would say they do not stand in one important respect. Freud thought, and this is based on his philosophical premise of physiological materialism, that the factor which was primarily responsible for the formation of character was the libido, was the satisfaction or frustration or distortion of certain instinctive urges, and that the whole of character development is to be understood as a sublimation, as a particular outcome of this libidinous structure which begins already in childhood. I personally, and many others, believe that this was an error. That the character of the child develops not in response to what happens to his libidinous desires, but develops in response to what you might call the total interpersonal atmosphere in which he lives. By that I mean, more specifically speaking, it develops in reaction to the character of his parents. Whether the parents have respect, whether they feel love, or whether they tend to dominate, they tend to force, and all the many things which make up the particular interpersonal relatedness between one person or another.
This cannot be simplified, then, to say that libido for a sexual basis is sufficient. This is not to discard Freud's idea, but simply to recognize that it did not go far enough.
It did not go far enough, and it was quite one-sided. Perhaps I could give a very specific example. Many people are influenced or were influenced by Freud's ideas that it makes a great deal of difference whether a child is breastfed or not breastfed, that this has an influence on what Freud calls his oral libido and therefore determines his character. Well, actually, I don't think that is so. It doesn't matter too much for the character development, how it is fed, but what matters is how it is loved. What the total response of the mother to the child is, whether it is a giving response or a restrictive response. A child can be breastfed by a mother who does not know how to love, and it will have the same reaction as if it were bottle fed or anything else. And on the contrary, a loving mother might not breastfeed the child, and yet the child will have the experience of complete acceptance and love. In other words, it does not mean much what the technicality is of the satisfaction of the instinctual drives. But what matters is what the total configuration, what the total impact is of the mother's and the father's attitude to the child, of the responses which the child learns to accept as the reality of life, as that form of response which it later on tends to expect from everybody else.
You have heard Dr. Erich Fromm, psychoanalyst and author, as recorded in his study in Cuernavaca, Mexico. Now, to continue our discussion of Freud and childhood, we'll switch to Studio C at San Bernardino Valley College, where we'll join Dean Robert Nisbet of the University of California, Riverside, Professor Floyd Ross of the Southern California School of Theology, and Dr. Edward Rudin, Chief Psychiatrist of the Riverside State Mental Hygiene Clinic. Dean Nisbet is our moderator.
Well, gentlemen, we've heard Erich Fromm on the subject of childhood, and I think we might begin, as usual, with some quick reactions from each of us on the subject of Erich Fromm's reactions to Freud. Dr. Rudin, why don't you begin?
Well, I think that it is important first to recognize that both the concept of infantile sexuality and the concept of early character formation means that the great emphasis is placed on the impact of the environment on the child in his first 6 years of life, that this becomes a primary focus as a result of Freud's studies. I would tend, from my own experience, to disagree with Fromm in his implication and, in fact, direct statement that he feels that the theories and concepts of infantile sexuality are well accepted. My experience has indicated that while there may be intellectual acceptance of infantile sexuality, that there is not an emotional acceptance of this, that it tends to be still too frightening a concept for most people to be able to either understand or to respond to without anxiety.
What do you mean, Dr. Rudin?
Well, I think, first of all, that this whole subject of infantile sexuality means many things to many people. And as Freud used this concept, and as it is the basis of his theory of the understanding of childhood, it truly represents erotic pleasures which the child develops from birth on, centered around various areas of his own body, which progress and evolve in the course of his development through puberty, and that certainly, as Fromm cited, there is not suddenly some arising of erotic impulses at the time of puberty. And certainly it is my experience that parents do not emotionally accept the concept that their infants, that their sweet, innocent, and wonderful little babies have, in fact, some erotic sensations.
Mm-hmm. Professor Ross, would you like to add your comment?
I'll be interested later in raising this question, whether the child's character has formed so rigidly in the first 5 or 6 years of life that no growth in the fundamentals can take place thereafter. But I was interested in Fromm's pointing out what I think many parents need to hear today for a second or a third time, namely that it isn't the little technicalities of how we deal with the infant which are so important, whether the infant is breastfed, for example, or bottle-fed. But what is important, primarily anyway, is whether the infant really feels accepted or warmly loved. I think this may set at rest some of the problems that some people have developed over this whole matter of whether one was properly fed in his first 6 months of life.
Well, I think my own first reaction to Dr. Fromm's comments on Freud would take the form, first of all, of what I would offer here as a criticism, really, of both Freud and Fromm, and that is the lack of recognition of the cultural or the intercultural factor in the development of character and in the conception of childhood. I'll put it this way. I sometimes wonder whether Freud, had he lived in a society that had a different structure of the family and had a different conception of childhood than the one in which he lived, whether on the basis of his studies of patients and his observations of family relationships would have come up with this all-important emphasis on the first 5 years of life. It is, I take nothing away from the importance of the first 5 or 10 years in any human being's life. We all recognize the profoundly important role of childhood. But on the other hand, it seems to me that there are some indications that the power of culture and the power of interpersonal relationships is sufficient to take some of the edge off the emphasis that Freud gave, and Fromm also, to this first 5 years.
That leads me to raise a question of our psychiatrist friend here. If we take a truly dynamic interpretation of the growth process, is there any reason, Ed, why we should feel that character has formed so tightly by the 6th year that there will be no, shall we say, significant changes after that in the life of a growing person?
It seems to me, Floyd, that in your earlier remarks and in this question, you join Dean Nisbet in raising the same kinds of questions that everybody raises, and perhaps for the very same reasons. You are both, perhaps without realizing it, questioning, needing to express doubts that the first 6 years of anyone's life could possibly be so important. And I think that you are responding to some anxieties about this, because this places a good deal of critical charge on a very limited period in our lives. It places tremendous responsibility on the parents who constitute the major environment of the child during these first 6 years. And I think that we all tend to try to run away from this as best we can. The character formation that both Fromm and Freud are talking about have to do with the development of the capacities of the individual to handle his own libidinal energies in the face of what the environment, his parents, expect of him or want from him. Now, part of these libidinal energies have to do specifically with erotic impulses, with love impulses of a physiologic, pleasurable level. And this is a frightening concept for all of us. The fact is that the fact is according to Freud's theory, and the fact is according to my own clinical experience, and I think the fact would also be true for the Neo-Freudians too, that this is the period during which the individual develops the modes with which he harnesses his libidinal energies and develops the capacity to estimate the world around him, the environment around him, so that he can interpret it more correctly to himself. What happens after these first 6 years is certainly further experience with the world around him. And this experience increases his facility. It makes it possible for him to perhaps react with less stress, with less anxiety in certain critical situations. But the basic patterns of reaction are well established by the 6th year. All he does is to refine these patterns a little bit, to perhaps decorate them a little bit. The basic structure of character, the basic confrontation that the individual has with his own inner drives has occurred in these first 6 years of life.
Well, all right. Allowing for the moment the crucial importance of the first 5 years, what about the heavy emphasis that Freud gives to infantile sexuality? Here again, I'm wondering if Freud wasn't, to a very considerable extent, responding to some of the moral and cultural pressures of the late 19th century. Think of the code of morality of that time, which in Western Europe placed very heavy weight upon the sexual aspects of morality, the changing family, the blanket, if you like, of what we would think of as Victorian morality. At this time, sex and the general infractions which were associated with sexual life were regarded as major. Now, isn't it possible that if Freud, I realize this is a difficult question to answer, but I offer it seriously, isn't it possible that if Freud had been living in a society such as our own now, in which sex is dealt with more neutrally, in which the pall of Victorian morality doesn't lie so heavily over its treatment, that he would never have given such emphasis to sexuality, the sexual libido, and infantile sexuality?
I think that if this were the case, Dean Nisbet, that we would find in our clinical practices that our theories about infantile sexuality would collapse. We do not find emotionally the tolerance of infantile sexuality that you imply exists. We find an intellectual tolerance of sexuality, an intellectual paying attention to our not repressing little Johnny. But emotionally, we find great resistance on the parts of our culture and on the parts of our parents to the little gestures that children make which have obvious erotic implications.
Would you say that this may be due to the fact that the parents have not faced some of the implications of their own sexuality or their own unresolved sexual problems?
Yes, I think this is exactly the fact. We may be able to deny our unresolved sexual conflicts until somebody puts a mirror up to us. And in a sense, this child who is so openly expressing his own erotic impulses is holding up the mirror to us of our own early childhood. And what we have tried to forget, we now suddenly come face to face with. And we become anxious, we become disturbed, and very often we then project this onto the child and say he's the naughty one, rather than to say I'm the naughty one.
Well, I think probably what you say, Dr. Rudin, on the age 1 to 5, might be more nearly of a universal trait than would be the case when we were dealing with children of older ages. Take, for example, the problem of adolescence. There was a time when the storminess, the general tension, the intractability of the American adolescent, when all of this was explained by sudden new inner energies that were releasing themselves into a very large extent of a sexual sort. But what we have discovered on the basis of both historical and ethnological studies is that there are societies in which adolescence, for example, is a relatively tranquil period. And we have therefore been forced to conclude, I think, that much of the storminess and the difficulty of adolescence in American life is the awakening consciousness of the American child before the richness of alternatives in American culture. Here is where I should think that a physiological and specifically a Freudian explanation might be much weaker than is the case of the small child.
What we see happening in adolescence, and I think your point is well taken, adolescence does not mean the same thing in all cultures. We may even question whether there is such a thing as adolescence in some cultures. Adolescence is a kind of psychological, cultural response at a certain age. But what we see happening in adolescence is that the individual who has gone through his infantile sexual development, has gone through these erotic stages in his life, has gone through the relationship between these erotic stages and the important people in his life, is now suddenly physically able to express the impulses which he has not been able to express before this time. He is living in a larger world, as you well pointed out. He's not restricted to the intimacy of his relationship with his mother, father, and siblings. He has a larger field in which to play, and he has greater physical capacity, so that he suddenly begins to enact the very conflicts, the very drives which he has been keeping within him or expressing in relatively innocuous ways for all of the previous years. With all of the earlier expressions, minimal as they were, they didn't bother anybody. But the teenager bothers people because he's expressing these conflicts in a way which disturbs the family and the society.
Isn't it true that the adolescent is really confused within himself as well as being opposed to the authority figures around him? That is, he's becoming aware now of some real contradictions in his own nature. He's really trying to get on his horse and ride off in two directions at once, as somebody has said. He's also rebelling against the parents as the authority figures. At the same time, he's becoming aware of a very strong heterosexual interest. This is the end of a long process, isn't it? Because as an infant, he was attached exclusively to the mother. Think how many months or possibly years it takes the child to get to the place where he understands why there's a man around the house at all. Having started with an attachment to the mother, which perhaps has been displaced by a greater attachment to the father, there comes this period when he feels a need to be independent of both mother and father, and he also has this strong impulse to find a new kind of relationship with a person of the opposite sex, but not the mother or the father.
Of course, in our society, which has become more and more urbanized, and with the father typically working a considerable distance from the home, I would say there has been a tendency to enhance the mother-child relationship over what existed in an earlier day. As long as we had the family farm predominantly characterizing the American economy, the father was around the home, or at least around the fields, as much as the mother. And both the little girl and the little boy were in a position to identify with the father, really, as often as they could with the mother. Today, normally, the father leaves the house early in the morning, doesn't return till late afternoon, or in many areas until well after the children's dinner or even bedtime, and the child is thrown together with the mother to an extent that must have been altogether undreamed of at an earlier time. But let me mention one more aspect of the cultural or the intercultural phase of this. When we make studies, as we have, of different forms of community, both in this country and elsewhere, we find, for example, that standards of child rearing vary a great deal You'll find one people, for example, one minority people, who pay very little attention to the behavior of their children during age 1 to 5. They may love them, give them all the affection they need, but as far as the don'ts and the injunctions to remain clean, to clean up after yourself, do this, do that, those don't exist among many peoples. And it may well be that this produces in the long run a more disciplined character than the kind of character that is produced in our society, our middle-class society, where most of us are inclined to start making little adults of our children almost from the very beginning.
Professor Ross said earlier that in talking about the teenager, the specific problems that the adolescent has as a result of his being adolescent. And I'd like to point out that the problems which you cited, Floyd, were the problems that we could identify earlier in the life of this individual. The problem of conformity, what his own particular role is in the society, the elements of rebellion, at what point does one obey, at what point does one need to prove individuality and independence. This is precisely the struggle that we see going on in the 1-year-old, in the youngster, a year and a half old, who goes through this period of intense negativism and has to prove to you that, by golly, he's not going to go to bed. He doesn't care what you say. Well, isn't this pretty much what we're seeing in the teenager? Even the conflict about heterosexuality. When we think of the 3 or 4-year-old little boy who makes all sorts of propositions to his mother about getting rid of daddy or letting daddy stay out of the house, who is making exactly the kinds of propositions to his mother that he's going to be making to a girlfriend some 10 years later. The only difference, apparently, being that as long as he remains under the age of 5, the parents feel that they can cope with this by repressing it.
True.
It can be more easily managed. But when he gets to be a teenager, he isn't quite under our thumbs as much as we'd like him to be, and he can express rather than repress.
Furthermore, he has so many groups of his own age that he can begin to identify with that the absolute necessity of father and mother is no longer present. Well, I think we've reached the point where we can probably summarize this very briefly as being an essential agreement, both with Freud and with Dr. Fromm, on the crucial role of childhood in the formation of character, on the certainly existent influence of infantile sexuality, but also much impressed by the role of interpersonal relationships through later life, perhaps to a degree that goes beyond what Freud himself expressed and adhered to. And I think, gentlemen, Dr. Rudin, Chief Psychiatrist of the Riverside State Mental Hygiene Clinic, and Dr. Floyd Ross, Professor of World Religion, Southern California School of Theology, we can end on this point.